Having just graduated from college with a business degree, I found myself back in my childhood home, with the same creaking stairs, the smell of old wood, and the familiar chime of the kitchen clock that my mother had never replaced in all those years. My name is Anna, I'm 22, and frankly, I hadn't planned to return under that roof, where the walls remembered my childhood tears and youthful grievances, but here I am, back in my old room with its faded wallpaper and photographs on the wall, where I stand in braids next to my sister, a radiant Sarah, as always, the center of attention. My job search took less than a week, and when I received an offer from the marketing department of Davidson, I almost couldn't believe it. A decent salary, performance bonuses, the kind of prospects any graduate dreams of. That evening, over my mother's meatloaf, I shared the news, overflowing with joy. Even the air in the kitchen seemed to brighten when I told her I'd found a job. I'd decided to stay here for just a couple of months, save up some money, and then rent a small, but private apartment where I could finally breathe a sigh of relief and begin my adult life. But as soon as I said it, the clink of forks on plates suddenly died down. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, and I immediately recognized that look, the one that sends a chill through your chest, because it always foreshadows a conversation that won't bring joy. Mom slowly put down her fork and, looking down, said quietly, "Anna, you know that because of my back, I can only work half a day at the library now. The doctor has forbidden me from standing for long periods." Dad cleared his throat and added, without looking at me, "It looks like things are getting worse at the factory. There are rumors of layoffs. We could use your help with the bills." Mom quickly interjected, "At least you won't have to pay rent, that's easier, right?" I looked at my half-eaten meatloaf and suddenly felt trapped. I tried to smile, to say something comforting, but the words were stuck somewhere between gratitude and exhaustion. It really did make sense, to help my parents. They were always there when I needed them, and yet, somewhere deep inside, I felt like my own plans were being put on hold again. I nodded and quietly said, "Well, I guess I can stay a little longer." From that moment on, life flowed as usual. I rose early, went to work, returned in the evening, brought home my share of the paycheck, and Mom always put dinner on the table. We barely spoke, just existed together, each in our own rhythm, in our own care. It seemed to me that everything was proceeding calmly, predictably, as if everything had finally settled down, until last weekend. On Saturday morning, just as I was pouring myself a cup of coffee, the booming sound of a car engine was heard at the gate, and a minute later the door swung open, letting in a whirlwind, my sister Sarah, her husband Leon, and their children, Zita and Durant. The house seemed to come alive, laughter, voices, the scent of Sarah's perfume, everything filled the space with a festive, almost forgotten light. The change in my parents occurred instantly, as if someone had pressed an invisible button. Mom rushed to them, clutching Zita to her chest, laughing and repeating, "Oh, my precious angels." Dad, flushed and pleased, picked up Durant and placed him on his shoulders. "Sarah, darling, you look wonderful." Mom exclaimed, "Well, tell me, how are you? How is Leon? How are the children?" I stood in the doorway, clutching a cup, watching my parents literally blossom in the presence of their eldest daughter and her perfect family. They hung on every word, laughed at her jokes, asked questions about even the smallest details, about the garden, the book club, how quickly children grow up, and in that moment, it was as if I didn't exist. No one even asked how I was doing. No one inquired about my first week at my new job, even though I remembered how proud I'd been of my achievements. Making the dean's list, receiving the leadership award, then my parents simply nodded and said, "Well done, Anna," and that was it. "Anna, be a sweetheart and put on the coffee," Mom called over her shoulder. Not even looking in my direction, continuing to rock Durant in her lap. I walked silently into the kitchen, listening to the ringing laughter coming from the living room, the noise, the joy, the words. It all seemed to fade away as I stood at the sink, remembering how it had always been: Sarah, the star, beloved, important, needed, and I, the quiet shadow, nearby, always somewhere off to the side. I remembered myself at 11, sitting at the same table, holding a report card in my hands. I handed my mother the paper, hoping for at least a word of praise, but she barely glanced at me and returned to her conversation with Sarah about college applications. "That's sweet, Anna," she waved me off, then, brightening, turned to her sister, "Sarah, dear, so which universities are you considering?" Those years are forever imprinted in my memory as a time when everything revolved solely around Sarah, her successes, her plans, her brilliant future, in which, as Mom said, she was destined to shine. Every dinner turned into a parade of achievements, grades, certificates, extracurricular projects, advanced courses, all of it echoed around the table with such delight. As if it were a matter of national pride rather than a daughter's, I sat across from her, silently poking green peas with my fork, trying not to make a sound, so as not to disturb this chorus of praise, in which my voice was excluded. Dad, as usual, listened to Sarah with awe, asking clarifying questions, and Mom kept repeating, "You're simply wonderful, Sarah. I don't understand how we managed to make such a smart girl." Everything became even more vivid when the letter arrived informing her of her acceptance to university. I was 11 then, but I still remember that dinner as if it were yesterday, the aroma of roast chicken, Mom's trembling hands, the sparkle of tears in her eyes as she said, "We're so proud of you, darling. We can do this, can't we, Robert?" Dad nodded solemnly, as if signing the most important agreement of his life, and said in that same serious tone he usually used only when talking about work, "We'll take out a loan. Our Sarah needs to get the best education possible." A week later, when Sarah's suitcases were already packed and the house felt hollow, they called me in for a talk. We were sitting in the kitchen, Mom fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth, Dad looking past me, then sighed and said, "Anna, we're going to have to tighten our belts a little, the loan payments, Sarah's expenses, none of this is cheap." Those words were a turning point. I didn't yet know that from that evening on, everything would change, but I felt that our family now lived for Sarah and her future. My classmates bragged every year about their new phones, fashionable clothes, and vacation trips. I, however, carried an old flip phone, held together by a few bandages, and bought my clothes only at thrift stores, where everything was either a little too big or, conversely, a little too tight, but at least they were cheap. At Christmas, the gifts became practical: socks, notebooks, pencil cases, all marked "needed for school." Mom always repeated, writing out the next check, "Your sister needs to focus on her studies, we can't let her worry about money." These words sounded like an apology, but I knew it wasn't an apology, it was the law. At 15, I realized that if I didn't want to end up like my parents, I'd have to forge my own path. I joined every club imaginable, from debating to math, participated in competitions that awarded small but meaningful scholarships, and wrote essays until my fingers ached with fatigue. I wasn't just a good student, I studied as if my life depended on every grade. I thought if I achieved a perfect score, they would finally look at me the way they looked at Sarah. And I guess it worked, because by graduation, I received a full scholarship to State University. I remember how my hands trembled when I brought the letter home, and how relief crossed my parents' faces for the first time in a long time. Dad squeezed my shoulder, Mom smiled, not as broadly as she had once smiled at Sarah, but still genuinely, and said, "That's wonderful, Anna. You're doing great, we won't have to pay anything." For them, it was happiness, for me, it was proof of my worth. Meanwhile, Sarah finished her studies, moved to Brighton, got a job at a major company, and soon married Leon, her student sweetheart. 2 years later, Zita and Durant were born, and her parents seemed over the moon. Mom literally glowed when she talked about her perfect daughter and her perfect family. Dad brought photos of his grandchildren to work and showed them to his colleagues, and I was no longer surprised. I was used to being close, but not in the center. Sarah's monthly visit turned into a mini performance with a predetermined script. The door would swing open, and the house would fill with voices, laughter, and the scent of expensive perfume. I barely had time to say hello before Sarah would be giving errands and planning her weekend. "Anna, will you look after Zita and Durant while Leon and I go shopping? I haven't been out in a while," she'd say, less a question than a fait accompli. Leon usually just nodded, looking at his phone, and I knew arguing was pointless. The first few times, I tried to suggest to my parents that we stay with the kids, hoping to salvage at least a little of my weekends, but my mother would smile softly and reply, "They miss you so much, Anna, you can see how Zita is drawn to you," and of course, I couldn't say no. "Oh, darling," Mom said, hugging Sarah and gently stroking her back, "you know, I'm having a hard time keeping up with the little kids, and your father needs a rest on the weekends. He works hard at the factory all week, poor thing, so, Every Saturday turned into another endless children's marathon for me, in which I was the main and only participant. Zita and I watched Frozen for the 100th time. She singing along with Elsa with such delight that I almost hated the cartoon, while little Durant armed himself with markers and tried to turn the walls of my bedroom into his own personal gallery. Sarah and Leon were having lunch somewhere with friends, probably posting pretty photos with glasses of wine and the hashtag Familias outside, while my parents wandered around the garden, occasionally popping in to ask if I needed anything, saying it with an expression as if they were doing me a great favor. I tried to reassure myself that it was just one weekend a month, that it was no big deal, that I was just a good aunt who helped out because family was sacred, but the more I repeated these words, the more empty they became. A year flew by in this monotonous rhythm: work, bills, kids, Sarah's constant noisy visits. I had almost gotten used to it, almost resigned myself to it, until one evening changed everything. I was standing at the sink, washing the dishes after dinner, when the phone rang from the kitchen and my mother's surprised voice asked, "Sarah? Honey, what happened? Why are you crying?" Then came the sobs, muffled and desperate, and even over the roar of the water I could make out individual words. "Leon's company went bankrupt without warning. We can't pay the rent. We have no savings." My mother's voice became hurried, soft, full of worry and concern. "Oh, darling, of course, don't cry. Everything will work out. Tell me everything calmly." I moved closer, keeping the water running, as if I wanted to remain unnoticed, but Sarah's voice was so loud I heard every word, and when my mother said, "Maybe you could stay with us for a while?" "Of course, honey, of course you can." I felt a chill run through me. My stomach sank, my heart sank, and I took a step forward, clearing my throat. If they're moving, maybe now would be a good time for me to rent an apartment?" The words slipped out, like an attempt to protect at least a shred of privacy, but Mom looked at me as if I'd suggested burning the house down. "Anna, don't be silly," she snapped. "There's room for everyone, we're family." Dad nodded and added in his undeniable tone, "In tough times, family sticks together." And so, a week later, they arrived, 3 cars, crammed full of stuff: trunks, bags, children's toys, boxes of clothes, even a toaster and coffee maker. Everything was unloaded in our driveway. As if we were about to open a branch of their old life, I spent the morning moving my things from the bedroom into what had been the closet. It barely accommodated a narrow bed and a tiny dresser, with only enough space between them for one step. My old room, spacious, bright, with a window overlooking the garden, was now the nursery, because children need space to play. As Mom said, Zita was already 5, and Durant 3, and the entire house instantly became their personal playground. They raced through the hallways, tripping, falling, laughing, shouting, arguing, demanding attention, all against the background of Sarah's loud TV. She was sitting in the living room, reclining on the couch, chatting on the phone with a friend, discussing how this transition was hard for her and how Leon is trying so hard, but it's hard for him too. When Zita and Durant burst into my tiny room for the 10th time and scattered my work papers all over the floor, I couldn't stand it any longer. "Children, be quiet. Please don't touch this, it's important." Sarah didn't even turn her head, she just waved her hand and said, without looking up from her phone, "Anna, why are you being such a nag? They're just playing, don't be a bore." I looked at her sitting there, surrounded by the chaos and the attention of everyone around her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something more than just irritation boiling inside me, something much deeper, quieter, and more frightening. After work, I dreamed of only one thing: closing the door behind me, sitting on the edge of my bed, and simply being silent, letting my head clear of the numbers, emails, calls, and endless spreadsheets that filled my day. But instead of silence, I was rewarded with Baby Shark playing from the nursery on endless loop, accompanied by Zita's squeals, the patter of little feet down the hall, and Sarah's ringing laughter echoing from downstairs. She was, as usual, watching something on TV. Seemingly oblivious to the roar of her joy filtering through the walls. Leon, for his part, spent his days in the kitchen, ostensibly looking for a job, though more often than not I saw him sitting at his desk, staring at his phone, with that worried expression that says, "I'm doing the best I can," when in reality, he's simply escaping reality. "The job market is tough right now," he repeated whenever asked, and always added confidently, as if he wanted to believe it himself, "but I'm sure Something will come along soon. At night, I lay in my tiny bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house go on and on, laughter, footsteps, voices, the television, the clatter of dishes, all blending into one continuous hum from which there was nowhere to escape. I wondered how it had come to be that I had once again found myself in a situation where I had no peace, no personal space, not even the right to be tired. Every time the urge to talk about moving arose in me, I remembered my mother's icy gaze and my father's solemn tone. "We're a family, Anna, a family sticks together," and I fell silent. Until the first utility bill arrived after they moved in, I stood in the kitchen, holding the paper in my hands, and couldn't believe my eyes. The numbers were almost twice what I was used to seeing: electricity, water, heating, everything had skyrocketed. The water bill was especially terrifying, and I immediately imagined how many times a day Sarah filled the kids' bath, washed clothes, and ran the dishwasher at half power. I opened my banking app and realized that my savings, which were supposed to be the first step toward independence, were melting away before my eyes. That evening, at dinner, I finally decided to speak up. We were all sitting together, as always, and I spent a long time fiddling with my fork, rolling peas around my plate, before finally saying, "The bills have almost doubled since last month. I simply can't cope on my own. It's almost my entire salary." At first, no one said anything, then Sarah's fork clanged against the plate, and she said, not hiding her irritation, "Are you seriously complaining about money now? Anna, Leon and I have lost everything. We have no savings. No home, no security for the future." I tried to speak calmly, but my voice still trembled. "I'm not complaining, I just think we need to somehow split the expenses fairly," Sarah interrupted, louder this time. "Fair? Can you even hear yourself? We're going through the hardest time of our lives, and all you think about is money." Mom immediately intervened, her tone gentle but peremptory. "Sarah's right, Anna, family helps family, that's what we've always done, now's not the time to count pennies." Dad nodded solemnly, as if confirming what he'd told the jury. "Your sister and Leon need support, nothing else matters." I looked at my plate, feeling a lump in my throat. I wanted to say that I was family too, that I had my share of hard times. But I swallowed the words like cold peas and quietly exhaled. "Okay, never mind." A week later, Leon finally got a job at an insurance company. The pay was lower than at his previous job, but Mom greeted the news as a victory. Sarah also seemed inspired, at least for the first couple of days, and looking at them, I allowed myself to naively believe that maybe now everything would start to improve, but I was wrong. Sarah almost immediately began complaining, first about being tired, then about the children, then about life in general. "It's so hard being alone with them all day," she said, rolling her eyes. "Leon leaves at 8 and comes back at 6, and I can't even take a shower in peace." These complaints quickly escalated into requests, at first innocent, almost mundane. "Anna, watch the kids for an hour, I'm going to the store." Then, "Anna, be a kind person and stay with them while I take a shower." Then, "Anna, please take Zita to her activity center, I'm so tired." And every time I said yes, because I knew that if I said no, I'd hear the same thing again: "We're family, family helps family." Only now it sounded not like support, but like a sentence. Before I knew it, those small, seemingly innocent favors had turned into something more, a constant obligation, a quiet duty that no one had agreed upon, but for some reason everyone took for granted. I'd come home after a long day at work, tired, wanting only to kick off my shoes, make some tea, and have at least 10 minutes of quiet, and almost always find Sarah already dressed up, with bright lipstick and a shiny handbag slung over her shoulder. "Oh, I'm glad you came," she'd say as she ran, grabbing her coat from a chair. "Leon and I are meeting some friends for dinner. The kids have already eaten, but they'll probably need something by 8. We'll be back before 10. And before I could respond, the door had slammed behind them, leaving behind the scent of her perfume and 2 pairs of children's eyes fixed on me. Anticipating the evening show, weekends became a personal nightmare. Sarah and Leon, with the casualness of people confident that the world will always adapt to their needs, announced their plans on Friday evenings. "We're going shopping with friends tomorrow. I think there's a movie on Sunday. The kids will stay with you, of course. They have so much fun with you." As if by agreement, Mom and Dad began visiting more often with distant relatives, whom they'd previously mentioned only once a year but now suddenly found vital. Ironically, They usually left half an hour after Sarah and Leon left the house, leaving me alone with Zita, who always had new creative ideas, usually on the walls, and Durant, who managed to throw tantrums over the most absurd things, like me cutting a sandwich wrong. My Saturdays turned into an endless series of children's songs, piles of plastic toys, sticky tables, and macaroni and cheese, which seemed to have become my eternal culinary sentence. By Sunday evening, I felt drained, with an aching back, a throbbing head, and a desire to simply disappear, to vanish into thin air. The house was a mess, toys strewn everywhere, paint stains on the floor, and a feeling of fatigue that didn't subside even after sleep. But despite this, I still cooked dinner for everyone, because my mother invariably showed up at 7, peered into the kitchen, and softly said, "Anna, dear, we're not going to order in. Are we? Homemade is always better." One evening, after a particularly grueling weekend, when I could literally feel my hands shaking from exhaustion, I finally decided to speak up. We were sitting at dinner, Sarah was talking about a new cafe she and Leon were going to, Mom was nodding along, and I suddenly put down my fork and, trying to keep my voice calm, said, "I need to talk to you all." The room grew a little quieter, only the sound of children's laughter drifting from the next room. "I'm really tired," I continued, feeling the words threatening to spill out. "This whole preschool situation, so to speak, isn't working for me." Sarah immediately looked up, her eyes narrowing, as if I'd just said something offensive. "Not working," she repeated, her voice laced with mockery. "Are you saying you don't enjoy spending time with your nephews?" I took a deep breath, about to explain that wasn't the point, but Mom had already gently intervened, reaching out and patting Sarah's hand. "Don't worry, dear, Anna's just tired. This is actually even good for her. She'll need the experience when she becomes a mother herself. Think of it as practice." I felt something inside me snap, but I said nothing. Sarah smirked smugly and returned to the conversation about her day. Leon nodded. Mom and Dad listened, their eyes fixed on her as if she were their favorite actress, and I sat across from her, invisible, shoveling cold food around the plate, feeling less like a family member and more like a housekeeper who'd accidentally found herself at the same table with the family. After that conversation, nothing changed. To be honest, it even got worse. Sarah and Leon seemed to take my words as a challenge, as proof that they weren't challenging me enough. They began going out more and more often, finding new excuses, a meeting with friends, a colleague's birthday, or simply needing a change of scenery. On Friday evening, I saw them standing by the door, holding the car keys. "We're meeting friends at a new restaurant downtown," Sarah said, already halfway to the exit. "The kids have already eaten, thanks, Anna." And every time, I'd stand there in the middle of the living room, staring at the door slamming behind them, feeling a wave of helplessness wash over me. Weekends became what I'd dreaded, a real ordeal. I'd wake up with a knot in my stomach, knowing I'd spend the next 2 days comforting Zita, reconciling Durant, cleaning up spilled juice, and listening to endless episodes of Paw Patrol while Sarah and Leon lived their best lives, and I gradually forgot I'd ever had one. And then came that Wednesday, which, as it turned out, changed everything. The day dragged on endlessly, the air in the office was stale, the keyboards clicked like metronomes, and the numbers on the screen swam before my eyes as if I were looking through a fog. I sat at my desk, trying to finish a marketing report, even though every cell in my body was screaming for only one thing: peace. It seemed like all the energy I once had was lost somewhere between the screaming children. Endless weekends of cartoons and family dinners where no one listened to my voice. And just when I was about to admit defeat, Rachel, my colleague and perhaps the only person who still remembered that I was more than just Auntie Anna, swept into my cubicle like a fresh breeze. She perched on the edge of my desk, smiling easily, and asked, "Hey, want to do something fun this weekend?" I looked up at her with tired eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of curiosity. "The guys and I are going to Pine Ridge," she said, leaning closer. "It's a small ski resort, nothing grand, just a weekend getaway. I hear the snow's perfect there right now. Want to come with us?" I felt something click somewhere inside, beneath the layer of fatigue, like a tiny spark. The thought of getting away, even if just for 2 days, to a place where no one would demand attention, where the air smelled of pine trees and not fried chicken nuggets, seemed almost unreal. "And yet," I said, "sounds tempting." Rachel smiled. "Then it's settled. We sail Saturday morning and return Sunday evening." Just pack some warm clothes and get ready to relax. On Friday evening, I stood in my small room, what had once been a storage room, and for the first time in months, I felt joy, anticipation, albeit cautious. My duffel bag lay on the bed, and I packed a turtleneck, warm socks, and ski gloves. Everything seemed almost magical, the very act of packing, as if I were returning to my old self, the one who once dreamed of independence and ease. I was just rolling up my thermal socks when Sarah appeared in the doorway. She was leaning against the doorframe, with that expression I knew all too well, a mixture of surprise and irritation. "What are you doing?" she asked, looking at my bag. "Packaging," I replied calmly, "going to Pine Ridge with friends for the weekend." Sarah's face instantly darkened, her lips pursed, and her voice turned cold as steel. "You need to cancel your trip," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. I looked up, stunned by her impudence. "Sorry, what?" I asked, trying to figure out if I'd misheard. "You should stay home," she said, crossing her arms. "Leon and I are going to Aunt Linda's 60th birthday party in Millbrook. Mom and Dad are coming too. Someone needs to watch the kids." I couldn't help but laugh, short, bitter, but genuine. "You're kidding, right?" I said, continuing to carefully fold my ski pants. "You can't seriously expect me to cancel my plans because you didn't think to tell me in advance." Sarah flushed, her cheeks flushing. "That's not funny, Anna, you're being completely unreasonable." "No," I replied, feeling anger boiling inside me. "What's unreasonable is that I have to drop everything whenever you feel like it to be your personal nanny again." She stood there for a few seconds, mouth open, as if unsure of what to say, then turned abruptly and stalked out, stomping loudly down the hallway. A moment later, I heard her voice cross the room. "Mom. Dad. Leon. You won't believe what Anna's doing." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of irritation wash over me. Not a minute had passed before I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, a veritable cavalry marching toward me. My tiny room was already cramped, but now, with Sarah, Leon, Mom, and Dad crowded in the doorway, it felt like a tiny box filled with the air of accusations. My mother's expression was one of disappointment, the kind she always reserved for conversations about my lack of understanding of family values. "What's this?" she said, placing her hands on her hips. "Are you going skiing?" I zipped up my bag and answered calmly, "Yes, I'm going to Pine Ridge with friends for the weekend." "But you can't," Sarah exclaimed, "we're having a party at Aunt Linda's." "No," I said evenly, "you're having a party at Aunt Linda's." I looked up and at them all. Why am I just finding out about this? Why wasn't I even invited? My mother hesitated, for the first time, it seemed, at a loss for words. Sarah took a step forward, her voice sweet, almost mocking. "Well, Anna, we just thought you'd be bored. It's a family event, grown-up conversations, you have no business being there. Besides, someone has to stay with the kids." And it was at that moment, looking at their faces, Mom's tired but gentle face, Dad's indifferent gaze, Leon's satisfied grin, and Sarah's haughty expression, that I realized for the first time how long I'd ceased to be part of their family. I wasn't a daughter, not a sister, but a convenient part of their life, built into a mechanism that, without my effort, would simply stop turning. "We've all discussed it," Sarah said with that same stubborn expression that always made my temples tingle, "and we've decided it's best for everyone. We're going to the party, you'll watch the kids, it's the most logical arrangement." She said it as if she weren't talking about me, a living person with plans and desires, but rather about some item on a to-do list that could be checked off. I looked at her for a long moment, in silence, and repeated, barely moving my lips, "the most logical arrangement." These words chilled me, as if I'd swallowed icy air. They'd already decided everything, without me, for me, as always. I slowly set my bag down on the bed and said, trying to keep my voice even, "You know, I've decided that this weekend I'm going to do what's convenient with my life." Sarah rolled her eyes, Leon smirked, and Mom sighed heavily, as if I'd started something absurd again. "Well, you can't bring little children to an elegant party," Sarah snorted, lifting her chin. "Aunt Linda said so directly, no children, this is an adult event." I picked up my duffel bag, slung it over my shoulder, and quietly replied, "That sounds like your problem, Sarah, they're your children." For a moment, everyone was silent, as if I'd uttered something blasphemous. Then Leon, frowning, finally spoke up. what's that supposed to mean? I looked straight at him, not irritated, but with the clarity that comes when a confidence long dormant somewhere deep within you suddenly awakens. It means exactly what you heard, Leon. I have plans, I'm going skiing. Your children are your responsibility, not mine. If you can't take them with you, either don't go, or hire a nanny. A nanny? Sarah shrieked, as if I'd suggested something absurd. With what money, do you think? Again, I shrugged, feeling a strange, intoxicating sense of power growing within me. Not my problem. I turned to face them all, feeling the weariness of the last few years drain away from me, like I was shedding an invisible weight I'd been carrying for too long. Let me make this perfectly clear, I said slowly, looking each of them in the eye. Tomorrow I'm going skiing, and I'm no longer going to be your free and easy babysitter, Sarah. I'm no longer going to let you steal my weekends, my plans, my life. If you need childcare, that's your responsibility as a mother. Stop assuming I'll always be there when you call. A deathly silence fell, the air seemed thicker, denser, and in that viscous pause, I suddenly felt myself being listened to, not just heard, but truly listened to, as if for the first time, everyone stared at me, as if I'd suddenly spoken a different language. Sarah opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. Mom looked as if she'd been struck by something invisible. Dad, out of old habit, tried to retreat to the side, hiding in the doorway, as if hoping the storm would pass. Leon stood nearby, still with the same bewildered expression that had settled on his face since his business failed and he'd never found the strength to admit defeat. The moment of this astonishing silence didn't last long. Sarah's face suddenly twisted, and she burst into dramatic sobs, covering her face with her hands, like a schoolgirl caught cheating. Her shoulders shook, the sounds grew louder, almost deliberately so. It all seemed like a performance staged for an audience. Leon, without looking at me, muttered something in which I clearly caught the words ungrateful. I didn't even want to hear the rest. Mom was the first to break down. Anna, she began in the voice she always used when she was about to lecture. After everything we've done for you, you're behaving completely irresponsibly, selfishly. Dad nodded without looking up. Completely selfish, he repeated, like an echo. I stood in the middle of the room, my duffel bag still slung over my shoulder, and watched my family transform into a Greek chorus of accusations. Their words rained down like hail, one after another, loud, harsh, humiliating, selfish, ungrateful, shameless, immature. Each one was meant to hurt, to make me feel guilty again, to return to my familiar role, quiet, submissive, comfortable. And then Mom, with an expression of triumphant finality, delivered what she obviously considered the final, knockout blow. If you walk out that door tomorrow, don't bother coming back into this house. There was a moment of silence, thick, heavy, like before a thunderstorm, and then I laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh, not hysterical, not an attempt to defend myself. It was real laughter, free, pure, almost joyful, the kind I probably hadn't laughed like in years. Everyone looked at me as if I were crazy, as if I'd suddenly said something so absurd that it had destroyed the order of their universe. But the longer they stared, the more I felt a surge of freedom building inside me, not anger or fear, but a wonderful, almost light sense of liberation, the way a bird might feel when it first flies out of its cage. You know what's funny? I said, wiping tears of what might have been laughter or relief from my cheeks. I'd been dreaming about moving out of this house for months. I just never had the courage, and now, Mom, Sarah, Leon, thank you, you've just given me the perfect excuse. Sarah's head snapped up, her cheeks flushed, and with a mock sob, she cried out, get out. Just get out then. Her voice wavered, and for a moment I thought I saw fear flicker beneath all that feigned anger, as if she hadn't expected me to actually do what I was saying. Gladly, I replied calmly. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and, without looking at them, dialed Rachel's number, putting it on speaker. Let them hear. Hey, Rach, I said, trying to sound casual, even though inside I was burning. Sorry it's late, but is your offer to spend the night still open? Maybe not just after skiing, but for a couple of days? Rachel's cheerful, slightly sleepy voice filled the room. Sure. I have a spare room, come over right now, it'll be perfect, I'll be home in 20 minutes, I smiled. Thanks, you're a lifesaver. I spent the next 15 minutes gathering up everything I could carry, a few bags of clothes, a laptop, documents, some dishes, books, a makeup bag, Each item I tossed into the box felt like it was lifting a layer of fatigue that had settled over the years. I walked up and down the stairs again and again, feeling myself breathe more freely with each step, their eyes on me behind me. Mom stood by the kitchen doorway, pale, her lips pressed together. Sarah, her head bowed, was whispering something to Leon, and he, leaning against the railing, simply watched me silently, as if he couldn't believe I was actually leaving. When the last box was in the trunk of my car, I returned to the house. They were all gathered in the living room, as if on cue. The air was thick with the scent of dinner, which I no longer smelled like my own. I looked at them calmly and said in an even voice, "Oh, and one more thing, since I don't live here anymore, I won't be paying the bills anymore. You'll have to decide for yourself how to pay for utilities, food, and internet. None of that is my concern anymore." My mother's face paled, as if I'd just informed her of some misfortune. "Anna, how can you?" she began, but I interrupted, trying not to raise my voice. "The utilities, the groceries, the bills, they're your responsibility now. I'm no longer part of this house." The words came out softly but firmly, and as I said them, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt like an adult. I turned and walked out the front door without looking back. Behind me, my mother shouted something, her voice shaking, veering from alarm to panic, but I didn't stop. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and at that moment, the sound was louder than any scream. The walk to Rachel's house was like a flash, a mixture of adrenaline and pure, genuine relief. I drove through the city at night, the radio off, listening to the smooth purr of the engine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was driving somewhere not out of a sense of duty, but by choice. My phone lay on the seat, pulsing with messages. I caught glimpses of names: Sarah, Mom, even Dad. Sarah's messages were long, angry, full of accusations. Mom's were pleading, tearful. Dad's were short, stern, like a verdict: "You let the family down." I didn't respond to any of them. When I got to Rachel's house, she was already waiting for me on the porch, wearing a cozy sweater, holding a cup of tea. She didn't ask a single question, simply helped me carry my bags and said, "You can stay as long as you want." And for the first time in months, I felt like I had someone by my side who didn't demand, didn't expect, didn't judge, who simply was. The next morning, as planned, we drove to Pine Ridge. The snow sparkled in the sun, the air was crisp and clean, and standing at the top of the slope, I suddenly realized I hadn't felt this alive in a long time. We skied, laughed until we cried, drank hot chocolate by the fireplace. And I caught myself not thinking about Zita, not checking my phone, not expecting someone to call with another request. All that was left behind, in the past, behind the closed door of that house. When we returned on Sunday evening, I sat down at my laptop and opened the apartment listings tab for the first time. Pages flashed by one after another, and with each new option, I felt a growing confidence within me. Now anything was possible. By Wednesday, I had already signed the lease, a small but bright one-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood, just 15 minutes from the office. A place where no one would raise their voice at me, where I could make tea, turn on some music, and just be myself. And, sitting on the floor of my new apartment among the cardboard boxes, for the first time in a long time, I felt not anxiety, but a quiet, confident happiness. My first week in the new apartment was like learning to breathe again, carefully, deeply, surprisingly aware that the air no longer pressed on my chest but actually filled my lungs. Every morning, I woke up to blessed silence, and this silence wasn't empty. On the contrary, it was soft, alive, almost gentle, as if the room itself were whispering, "Everything's okay now, you're home now." No children's screams, no stamping feet, no squeals of cartoons filtering through the walls, and most importantly, no guilt, which had become my constant companion under my parents' roof. I could make coffee and drink it while it was still hot, not after the 10th "Aunt Anna, I want juice." I could indulge in the luxury of not rushing to have breakfast, but looking out the window at the calm morning city. In the evenings, I'd light the lamp, sit in the armchair, and read books that had been gathering dust on the shelf for years, because I always felt it was inappropriate to spend time on myself. At home, sometimes I'd turn on a TV series, choosing anything from old melodramas to documentaries, simply because I could. My phone, of course, wasn't silent. Messages came one after another, with the same predictability as my parents' comments used to. "How could you abandon your family like that? Mom wrote, "We need you." Then Sarah, "You're so selfish. The kids are constantly asking where Aunt Anna is. Do you even understand how hard it is for them without you?" Then Dad, "Mom is very upset. You need to fix everything." Their words swirled in the same rhythm: guilt, accusation, pity, guilt again, and all in one breath. I read everything. I couldn't stop reading, but I didn't respond. My silence seemed to drive them crazy, because they were not used to the fact that they could not get through to me, could not pull the usual strings to control my actions. A week later, on a quiet evening, I was sitting on the new sofa, holding a cup of warm tea, when my phone rang again. Mom was on the screen. I stared at the call for a long time before hitting answer. "Anna," finally, Mom's voice was sharp, cold, and filled with reproach. "I can't believe you ruined our entire weekend. Aunt Linda's party was completely ruined because of your selfish behavior. Sarah and Leon couldn't come because you refused to watch the kids." I took a deep breath. "Mom, stop," I said quietly but firmly, "just stop. I can't listen to this anymore. I'm tired of being treated like a servant in my own home. I'm tired of having to sacrifice all my time, my money, my life for everyone else's convenience. I'm tired of being the unpaid babysitter and the family ATM, while they treat me like I'm nothing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, short and ragged, and I could almost see her lips pressed together, trying to find the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, but with that familiar raspy edge that always appeared when Mom tried to make me feel guilty. "Darling, I know it wasn't perfect," she said, "but we're family. We need you. You don't understand how hard it is without your help. Bills, groceries. This month is especially tough. We're struggling without you." I closed my eyes. "No, Mom," I answered calmly, "I'm done. Maybe someday we can communicate again. But only if it's different, as equals. No more manipulation, no more attempts to make me feel guilty, no more conversations where I'm treated like a child or a walking wallet. Until then, I need space. I need to live my life." I hung up and sat for a few seconds, listening to the ringing in my ears, as if the world around me had momentarily stopped. Then, without hesitation, I opened my phone and blocked her number. After that, Dad's, Saren's, even Leona's. Then I went on social media and deleted them all, one by one. It was a strange feeling, as if I'd cut the invisible anchor ropes that had held me down for years, and only now realized how much they'd been holding me back. I felt quiet, too quiet, but in this silence there wasn't loneliness, but space, big, clean, full of air and possibility. I sat by the window, looking out at the city bathed in evening lights, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not guilty, unwanted, or obligated, just myself. Maybe someday I'll accept my family again. Maybe, with time and distance, we can build something new, something respectful, with boundaries, without pressure and mutual expectations, or maybe not. But now I knew one thing: I would no longer sacrifice my happiness for the demands of others, and for the first time in many years, this knowledge didn't frighten me, it brought me peace.